sector, and he's been in the QFC for 2.5 years. Data protection is a lot when it comes to how the end user expects his data to be treated in companies, and we saw a lot of news recently with Google and Facebook when it comes to violating their data protection. So if you have any questions, please let us know if you're online, and you can raise your hands for the physical audience. I'll pass on the floor to Daniel to show you his presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Nasser, for that lovely introduction. It's going to be a second to get this on. Yeah, so today we're going to talk a little bit about the current and future data protection practices here in the QFC. I'm Daniel Patterson. I am actually the Commissioner for Data Protection here in the QFC, so I actually oversee compliance with our data protection regulations within the QFC. So as I said, today I'm going to talk about current and then our proposed update to our regulations that have just come through the consultation period. But I'm going to start by talking a little bit about technological change and the growth in data protection, just to give it a little bit of context about where all this is coming from. There's been a huge explosion in technology over the last 50 years. Processors have gotten smaller, the processing power has increased dramatically. Data storage has increased capacity and has gotten smaller and more affordable. So this has really changed and introduced new kind of techniques in terms of data analytics. So we have this idea of big data, we have artificial intelligence, we have algorithms, we have these neural networks that kind of map and model the human brain and how it functions. And we have machine learning and we have data mining. So this explosion in terms of technology and these new techniques have brought all these new companies into being. And so we all know Google since 1998, so that's what, 23 years ago? Facebook is only 17 years ago in 2004. Netflix, before 2007, were only sending out DVDs in the post to people in the US. And it's only 14 years ago that they began streaming online. And you know how big that is today. 2007 was the first iPhone. So 14 years ago. Seems a lot longer, but it's because it seems to be everywhere, but it's really, really new technology. Chime is an online digital bank. So it has about 12 million customers, 14.5 billion capitalization. It's the largest online bank in the US, and it's only been around since 2013. And that's not to mention the likes of Stripe, which has been around since 2013. N26, the German bank, been around since, I think, Stripe 2009, 2013 as well for N26, and Revolut in 2015. So these online digital banks are becoming very popular as well. And finally, TikTok since 2017. And TikTok, I think, now has 1 billion online active users every month. It's an incredible number of people who are using that service. So speed of acquisition has changed. I'm pretty sure we've all seen this slide before, which is how fast different industries have taken to get to 50 million users. So if you think about it, ATMs took 18 years before they had 50 million people using ATMs. It took cell phones 12 years. It took PayPal 5 years to get to 50 million. It took Facebook 3 years. And it took Instagram less than 18 months, and Pokemon Go just 19 days. So speed of acquisition of customers and online has just grown dramatically over the last number of years. So technology has increased, speed of acquisition has increased, but then what's really interesting is the amount of people online has been growing dramatically across the globe. So I picked 18 years, so the last 18 years of growth of the internet. It's kind of interesting because somebody born 18 years ago who's just becoming an adult today, when they were born, only 11% of the planet had access to the internet. In 2007, only 20% of people on the planet had access to the internet when the iPhone came out. In 2017, when TikTok started, over half of everybody on the planet now has the internet, and as of December last year, 64%. So that's about 4.5 billion people on the planet now have access to the internet on a daily basis. Layer in Facebook, so Facebook has 2.9 billion active users every month on their platform. So the amount of data that these firms are collecting, the amount of personal data is just incredible, and it's just growing exponentially every single month. So regulation has to be there to help kind of control it to a certain degree, but it's always playing catch up. I'm not going to give you a history lesson, so don't worry in terms of where we've gone through with data protection. But I wanted just to set the scene that this isn't something necessarily new, but it's something that's growing dramatically as the years progress as well. So if we take 1988, so Australia had a federal data protection law back then, and since then they've been dropping new territorial laws ever since. The EU has its data protection directive in 1995, and that's what's loosely based on our current regulations here in the QFC. Everyone talks about the US not having a federal data protection law, but they actually have other federal laws that complement data protection. So HIPAA deals with health information, COPA looks at child safety online, and they've been around since the 1990s. Russia has a data protection law since 2014. What's interesting there is they also have a data localization law. So if you want to process the personal data of Russian citizens, you have to do it in a data center in Russia first before you can transfer it outside. So that affects the likes of Facebook and Google and Twitter and all those guys. Qatar, we have our Protecting Personal Data Privacy Act from 2016. So that's actually ahead of the Gdpr if you think about it. Came into effect in 2018, and there's some really good guidance documents up on the ministry's website now to help be compliant with that piece of regulation. 2018 then saw the GDPR, and everyone in privacy knows the GDPR. It's just kind of seen as the gold standard. And it's been adopted by the likes of Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, but also China has its own data protection laws since 2018 as well, and they've been expanding those into child protection online as well. Now you can see the pace of change is increasing. So in 2019, Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, and Uruguay all dropped data protection laws. In 2020, Singapore, Thailand, New Zealand, South Africa, Brazil dropped their data protection laws. This year alone, we've seen Canada, Ecuador. We know Saudi Arabia is doing their law. There's talk of a federal law over in the UAE. Switzerland, Chile, Argentina are all coming up with their own data protection laws. This is a global issue, and it's being handled globally. So whether you're doing your business here in Qatar or you want to expand your business outside, you need to pay attention to data protection. So what we're trying to do with our regulations here is give you a platform that makes you ready for the big world outside. So today, I'm going to move on to our current regulations, and I'm not going to go through them in depth. I'm just going to pick kind of 4 key areas to just give you kind of a highlight over how those regulations have been set up. So it's a principle-based regulation. This means we give you a set of principles, and I don't know why that's not showing. So we give you a set of principles, and those principles dictate how you process personal data. So the principles are things like you have to do it fairly, you have to do it lawfully, and you have to do it securely. And fairly is about what you tell people. What do they expect you do with their data? What have you told them how you're going to process their personal information? Lawfully deals with, do you have a legal basis to process that information? Are you legally allowed to have it and use it? And I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. One of the other principles is you can only keep data for no longer than is necessary. So you need to know why you have the data, and then you have to get rid of it when you no longer need it. So you might have it because of anti-money laundering regulations, and they might say you need to keep it for 7 years after the transaction. But after that 7 years now, you have no reason to have that information, so why do you still have it? And you have to have a mechanism to delete it. There's also an accountability principle. So you have to be able to demonstrate, have systems and controls in your organization that show how you're being compliant with the regulations, or with the principles in particular. So I said lawful basis. So the regulations have a number of lawful bases, and for some reason nothing is coming up. But there are 6 lawful bases under the data protection regulations currently in the QFC. So the first one of those is consent. Unfortunately, it just says unambiguous consent. It doesn't give you any guidance about what that might look like, what is consent, how you're going to use that in practice. So that's something I'll talk about under the new regulations. You can process personal data based on necessary to enter into a contract. So this will be a lot of what you do on a day-to-day basis as a member firm. But it has to be necessary for the performance of the contract. So you can't just stick a clause in the contract about collecting personal data. If the contract can be fulfilled without the data, well then it's not necessary and it could fall foul of the regulations. there is a sixth and very interesting legal basis, and it's around legitimate interest. So you're allowed to grow your business. You have a legitimate interest to grow your business, but there's a test that's built in. So it's only where that legitimate interest does not override the legitimate interest of the data subject. So you have to do this balancing test. So you have to go, well, my interests are up here. Are the interests of the individual down here? And if they are, you're okay to go. But if my right to privacy forces it the balance this way, well, now you can't rely on that legal basis. So we haven't changed or won't be changing those legal bases in any real way in the new regulations, but you always need that legal basis to be able to process personal data. Data subject rights are a key element to the regulations. Finally, it comes up. So there are a number of rights built into the regulations. So there's a right to be informed. So this is that privacy notice that you have to provide, whether it's your customers or your staff, when you first collect their information. And here you tell them about what you're going to do with their data and how you're going to process it, if you're going to share it with anybody else, what their rights are under the regulations. Then there's a right of access, a right of rectification, erasure, objection, and restriction. Under the current regulations, it's not really very well described or fleshed out, so it's quite hard to understand when each one of these rights would apply and how you might action those. So we've tried to address that in the new regulations, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. And finally, data subjects have a right to raise a complaint. So if they think you're doing something wrong with their data, they can come to my office and say, we don't like what's happening in this particular firm, and then I have the powers to go in and investigate. So finally, under the current regulations are data transfers. And data transfers is a huge part of data privacy. Most companies are now international at some level, whether they use processors or service providers. If they're on the cloud, they're sending their data outside of Qatar or outside of the QFC. So the rules are, if you want to send the data outside of the QFC, you have to do an assessment of that jurisdiction, and that could be the state of Qatar, it could be Germany, it could be Ireland, and you have to say whether or not it offers the same level of protection as we do here in the QFC. So that's really complicated and really hard. We issued some guidance in relation to that earlier this year and a template, but it's still really difficult. And what it means is, if there are 8 companies or 10 companies all sending information to Germany, there's 8 different assessments. So it's not particularly practical, and they'll all be done slightly differently as well. But also, what happens if that assessment comes out to be not adequate? So pick the fictional land of Narnia and just say that assessment says, actually, no, they are rogue. They just do whatever they want with data. So it doesn't offer the same level of protection. We still allow certain situations to allow those transfers to take place. So one of them might be the explicit consent of the individual. So you could say, Daniel, I want to send your data over to Narnia for this purpose. Do you agree? And if I say yes, you're good to go. And then finally, if all the derogations under Article 10 that where it's a non-adequate jurisdiction fail, you can still come to me and look for a permit. That's really complicated. That's really hard. So that's something we've looked to address in the new regulations, and I'll talk about that when we come to that section. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of what we currently have in place. What we're proposing, and we've just come out of consultation, so hopefully we'll be good to go early next year on the new regulations, is not working either. Okay, sorry. So the first one is consent. So what we've done is we've introduced a new article in relation to what actually consent is, what constitutes valid consent under the regulations. So what is a valid consent? It has to be something that's freely given. So you can't make consent conditional upon something else. You can't say, unless you consent to marketing, you can't have my service. That will fail the test. It has to be specific. So you can't say, Daniel, we want to contact you by email, and then say, but also we want to come over to your house and sell you our product face-to-face. They would have to be separate, so they wouldn't be specific. It has to be informed. So there has to be enough information in the consent that I understand what's going to happen and what I am actually consenting to. And finally is this idea of an unambiguous indication that the data subject agrees. So this idea of having pre-ticked boxes now goes away, because if you don't want to receive marketing, untick this box it's really ambiguous. It's really confusing. It's definitely not clear if somebody actually wants to consent. So now you have to have unticked boxes, and they have to physically go in and click, yes, I want this, I want to sign up for your marketing, or I want to sign up for your newsletter. So that makes it much clearer. And if any one of those tests fail, the consent fails, and the whole basis of the processing now becomes illegal, and you're now falling foul of the regulations. Finally, in relation to consent, it has to be as easy to withdraw the consent as it was to provide it. So if you allow someone to go onto your website or go into your app and click yes for marketing, it should be as easy to go back into the app and untick the box to say, no, I don't want that anymore. So you can't say, well, you have to send me a letter in the post, it has to be written in German, and it has to be signed, in triplicate. So none of that will work. That will all fall foul of the regulations. Secondly is this idea of transparent communications. So yes, as I said, the regulations say you have to provide me a privacy notice, you have to react to my data subject rights. But what we've done in the new regulations is provide a bit of guidance about what or how those communications should look like. So they have to use clear and plain language, which means that you have to know your audience. So if your product is aimed at children, for example, your privacy notice would be written very differently than if it's aimed at college graduates or C-suite executives. So you have to know your market to know what clear and plain language looks like. In terms of responding to data subject rights requests, we've now introduced a time limit. Previously, it just said you had to do it, and there was no kind of guidance about what that looks like. So now you have 30 days to respond. That can be extended in certain circumstances by another 60 days, so 90 in total, but it's a pretty high hurdle you have to overcome. And you still have to contact them within 30 days to tell them that you're going to extend it by 60 days. The other thing with the communication is you can say no. So occasionally you can say to a data subject, no, actually, I'm not going to fulfill your rights request, because they're not all universal, and I'll talk about what that means in a second. But you still have to tell them why. You have to tell them why you're not going to respond, and you have to tell them that they can raise a complaint with my office. So this is about giving power and control back to the individuals whose data it is. And we're very careful that we use these terms like data controller and data processor, not data owner, because the person who owns the data is the customer, is the data subject. It's their data. So they have to have rights about how you use it, and you can only use it legally. This is about then the data subject rights themselves. So the same rights I discussed earlier are in the new regulations, except this time we've broken them out. So there's a article for every single right, and there's a lot more information about when and how that right applies. So for example, as I said, not all rights are universal. So the right to erasure, for example, I can't just go to my bank and after they've turned me down for a loan and say, please delete all of my personal data so I can reapply for the loan shortly afterwards using different information to hopefully get it. So the bank will turn around and go, no, we're allowed to hold that information for a period of time based on a law or based on some other process. And then they can come back to me and say, sorry, Daniel, we're not going to action your rights request. What we are doing, though, is introducing two new data subject rights within the regulations. So one is in relation to data portability. So to sum this up really kind of simply, it's where I have given you information, I can ask you to give it back to me in a machine-readable format. So that could be like a CSV file or something like that. But I can also ask for you to send it to another data controller so they can set up my account. So what this really drives is interoperability between systems and prevents lock-in. Because what we want to do is have an open environment where data subjects can move between suppliers, and it's not a barrier to entry then for new players in the market. So it's a really important right. The second new right is around automated individual decision-making, including profiling. So we're not saying you can't do it. And again, it's not a universal right, so it only kicks in when the automated decision leads to an actual legal effect, so something like maybe not getting a loan or getting a mortgage, or has some other significant effect on the individual. So it only kicks in those two limited circumstances, this legal effect and significant effect. And even then, they can object. So I, as a data subject, can say, well, that was a whole automated system. My credit application, it didn't really work properly because of my unique circumstances. And I can say, I would like a human to go and have a look at my application and see what happened. So that's kind of one of the key rights. So it's to stop automated systems just making decisions. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end when I touch on sort of data ethics and how these systems can have bias within them, and this is a way to help prevent any of that from happening. Data transfers, as I said earlier, the current regulations, it's really complicated and it's really actually quite confusing for firms to be able to navigate. So what we're going to do now is the Data Protection Office, we will now issue this list of adequate jurisdictions. So we will do all that work of assessing Germany and Ireland and Narnia, and we'll then have this full list of adequate jurisdictions. And if the country you're sending the data to is on the list, you're good to go. Nothing else needs to happen, you can just proceed. But we're still keeping back some situations where if they're not on the list, the transfer can still happen. And that could be, again, the likes of getting explicit consent or necessary for the performance of a contract. So we've been really mindful to make sure that this works for business. So this is as easy and straightforward, but also in a protected way. We have another transfer mechanism, which is these appropriate safeguards. So we will give you a set of contractual clauses you can put into your contract with the third party in the non-adequate jurisdiction. And once that's in the agreement, the transfer can go ahead. And in the EU, because this is a very similar model to the EU model, nearly all data transfers that happen from the EU to other countries happen based on these standard contractual clauses. So it is probably one of the most important areas of data transfers. Again, and then we still keep in that last option to look for a permit from my office should none of those other options apply. So the door is never fully closed, but again, data transfers is such an important area for the world as we start moving into cloud in particular. We've strengthened the data controller and data processor obligations within the regulations as well. So the person who decides on what and how we process in terms of personal data are the data controller. So they have to implement these appropriate and effective technical and organizational measures to ensure and be able to demonstrate that the processing is in compliance. That's a lot to unpack. So let's just, if we break it down, so they have to be appropriate and effective measures. So they have to look like they're going to work on paper, and then they have to work in real life as well. So you have to test them. They have to be technical and organizational. So you can't just rely on your IT security to be your control point. You have to have other organizational methods, and they could be things like policies and procedures and training. We've also introduced an obligation to report data breaches to my office within 72 hours. And there is an exclusion in there if the breach is unlikely to have an impact on the data subject. But what that means is you have to have a process to identify a data breach, to do an assessment of it, and then report it within 72 hours. And we will provide guidance on how you might do that, but it's very important. It's very important for us to know what type of breaches are happening across the estate, because then we know how we might need to tweak or help with guidance and support for the firms. Data processors then are not off the hook either. So now a data processor has to have a written contract to provide services to the controller. It can't be a verbal contract, it has to be in writing, and the regulations will provide some information on what needs to be in that contract. If a processor wants to hire a sub-processor, they have to get written approval from the controller, and if they have a data breach, they need to notify the controller without undue delay. We haven't put in a time limit, we've just said without undue delay, but that kind of means that if it happens this morning and you're pretty sure it's a breach, you should be telling the controller today and not delaying any further. And of course, data processors still also must have the correct organizational and operational controls in place to ensure that they're protecting the data correctly. Data protection by design and default. I would have said that this is inherent and implied in the current regulations, but now we're going to make it explicit. So this basically says that you need to think about privacy from when you're designing your products all the way through the life cycle to when you retire them. And this is making sure you're putting the right security measures in place, the right technical and organizational measures to comply with the regulations, to implement the principles, and then ultimately to make sure there's no loss or accidental disclosure of that data. And again, you need to make sure that you're only collecting the minimum amount of data to achieve your goals, and you have to make sure that people within your firm, if they don't need access to the data, they don't have it. And what's a really simple example of that is HR. HR data sits with HR. Your sales teams don't have access to people's salaries or or sick leave, etc. So they're already inherent in certain parts of our business, but then it becomes an obligation that you kind of put those walls in place. Privacy impact assessments, again, I would say this is, this is implied in the current regulations, but now it's explicit that you have to do an assessment of any high-risk processing before it begins to make sure you have you understand what the risks are and the right mitigants in place. So then you need some type of triage. So you're designing a new process. So you need to go, well, is this going to be a low, medium, or high-risk process? And that will take into account some of the types of data that you're using. And we will provide guidance and support and tools about how you might do that. And we'll certainly give a template for doing this assessment. And then it's all about making sure you are mitigating the risks you've identified. These things do not stop you processing. It is not about not doing it. It's about making sure you understand what the risks are and you're mitigating them correctly. So none of these things actually, they're never going to be a barrier to you processing or growing your business, but they're just there to help protect the data. So records of processing then is a current requirement under the regulation. So you need a list of all activities, all processes that use personal data. So and it has to be in place today, and I can ask for it at any time. What we're doing in the new regulations is just extending it to data processors. So where they process data on behalf of a controller, they need to have a list of those processes. But of course, if you think about it, that will be in the contract, that written contract that they have, so it should be a fairly easy exercise for them to do. But I really want to stress, this is not a box ticking exercise. This is not something just for me. If you do this correctly, what you have is kind of a map as to where all your personal data is within each one of your processes. So when it comes to writing your privacy notice, you can just go to your record of processing and go, well, here are all the processes, here's all the legal basis, here's the type of information, here's who we share them with, and then you just using clear and plain language, put that into a document that you provide to your customers or your staff. So it actually really helps you meet other obligations within the regulations. It's also very good for data subject rights requests, because you know where all your personal data processing is across your organization. So Daniel says, please give me a copy of all my information. You're able to then go, well, his email address is processed in these 4 different processes. Let's check to see if we've used his data there. The Data Protection Office and the role of Commissioner, so they were established back in July of this year, but what we're looking to do in the new regulations is to make it an institution of the QFC. So this gives it a certain amount of independence in how it oversees the regulations. The powers remain largely the same. So we have the investigatory powers, so we can ask for information, we can look for documents, we can go and access your premises if needed. We have authorization and advisory powers, so we can issue interpretation and guidance, and we will be issuing a comprehensive guidance document for the new regulations. But we can also then have the ability to publish that list of adequate jurisdictions, and we can issue those permits if needed. In terms of the corrective powers, we still have the same corrective powers in terms of issuing warnings, reprimands, blocking or stopping data processing if needed, and we have a new power to impose a financial penalty. But I don't want to scare anybody. Having the ability to have the financial penalty is a good tool to have, and it's both persuasive and dissuasive, but it's never our objective. Our objective is to help our firms through the compliance journey all the way through and be an open dialogue with how we're going to do that. But we need to have that in the background just in case somebody is willfully negligent in their compliance practices. So finally, we have certain remedies under the new regulations for data subjects. As I said, the right to complain to my office remains the same. So I can investigate a complaint should one come my way. We have now extended that. So where I make a determination based on the complaint, they can take that determination if they disagree to the tribunal and have a challenge. But now data subjects can now go around me. So they can choose not to lodge a complaint with my office and go straight to the court for an alleged infringement of the regulations. Again, that's really important that they have both the administrative remedy through my office, and they have the judicial remedy directly through the courts, because this helps show that you take their rights seriously and that they have a mechanism to have them enforced. We've introduced this new right to compensation and liability. So where there is an infringement or an alleged infringement, a data subject or a person affected can go to the court and look for damages. And those damages can be both material and non-material. So material is so if my data is leaked and my identity is stolen and somebody takes money from my bank account, that's material damage and I can go looking for that. But if that has caused me pain and suffering and anxiety and sleepless nights, I can now go to the court and say, well, I'd like to be compensated for that as well, and they can award an amount based on that. If it's one person and it's $50, it's not a really big deal. But if you had a data breach that had 100,000, a million customers, and they were each awarded $10, you can see how quickly it ramps up in terms of impact. And that has nothing to do with our office, that is just the effect directly on the data subject. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour through the new regulations. And just to finish, I was going to talk a little bit about data ethics. And this is an extract from a paper from the Alan Turing Institute over in the UK by a gentleman named Dr. David Leslie. And it's called Understanding Artificial Intelligence, Ethics and Safety. So it's part of a wider framework about how we build AI and responsible AI to help mitigate bias and discrimination within those processes. And it's built around these 4 themes of fairness, accountability, transparency, and sustainability. And when we think about fairness, these systems are built by people. We have limitations, we have our own biases, we can introduce human error into the system. So when we build these systems, we need to think, is the data we're using to train the AIs, is it representative? Is it fit for purpose? Do we look at the outcomes of the AI and say, well, is that what we expected for the individual or for the group of individuals of similar characteristics? Accountability and transparency are linked very closely together. The accountability, this idea that there's a human chain of accountability from design through to rollout is very important, but you need to have transparency within the model itself. So it can't be a black box. You need to understand how and why AI reached its decision for pure accountability to work effectively. And then finally, sustainability. So does the model continue to produce the results you expected over time? Are you looking at the impact on the stakeholders, as you evolve through those AIs? And I think as we go, these ideas link back to trust very importantly. If you lose trust of your customers, they'll go somewhere else. There's a huge amount of competition out there. So having that right amount of transparency, being compliant with the data protection regulations, telling people what you do with their data and being open and honest about how you're going to do that goes a long way to helping build that trust and helping grow your business. Thank you.
Scary.
Yeah, I hope that wasn't the goal.
No. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So the audience here is Fintech.
Yes.
Some of them are startup Fintech, some are scale-up Fintech, some come from abroad, some are homegrown Fintechs.
Yeah.
So I've noticed that all these Fintech companies, they work with banks. So
Yeah.
they provide technology to banks. Some of them are like payment service providers. They handle thousands and thousands of transactions of individuals who buy their stuff with merchants and shops, etc. So all that information, a data transaction, whether I buy my coffee in the morning, is somewhere there.
Yeah.
So can you advise fintechs what to do to make sure that that responsibility is not theirs, because it's mostly used for the banks. The banks here, they still think it's our data.
Yeah.
They don't think it's the customer data, it's our data. So what would you advise the fintech companies who provide the technology to do all these customer information from the merchants, from the customer to the banks? Is it the bank's responsibility or the responsibility of the technology providers, who in some cases may keep the data because the central bank wants them to store the data for a certain period?
Yeah, so it really comes down to what is the relationship between the bank and the fintech. So have you decided who's a data controller and who's a data processor in terms of the regulations? So who decides on the means and purpose? So the what and the how. And sorry, the why and the how. So the why is probably the most important element. So most of the processing is done because the bank is asking for it to be done. So they normally are the data controller. But the question is, does the fintech become a data controller in their own right, or are they only a data processor for the bank? And once you, and it does take a little bit of teasing out, and it'll have to look at the contract with the bank and the contract with the individual who signs up to use the service as to whether or not it's controller-controller or controller-processor. If it's controller-controller, yes, the fintech now has all the obligations of a data controller under the regulations, but they now have the data and they can do things with the data, and their privacy notice to the individual should cover any of the deeper analytics they might want to do to help grow their business or look at new markets or new opportunities. So it does really all come down to the kind of the fine print in the contracts, ultimately. I would have said you probably want to try and get a controller-controller type relationship where you get more control over the data as the fintech, and therefore there's more opportunities to mine it and look for opportunities within it. But then the bank might not want that. The bank might just go, no, we're the data controller, you're the processor, and unless we tell you you can do some data mining on it and we've gotten the right authorizations from the customer, you just can't do it.
So can we give you some typical examples ultimately later?
Yeah.
So that you can give advice to the typical fintechs what to do, what to include in the contract, how to protect themselves, or if something needs to be done from their customer. Because some fintechs, they deliberately use the data of the customer, let's say buying behavior,
Yeah.
and then provide that data to some source
Yeah.
who will pay them for those data,
Yeah.
and then give some of those proceeds back to the
bank.
user.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
User.
To the user.
Like spend-wise, I think you do that. Then you get loyalty and et cetera, et cetera. So, but then if you do that, then you have to have explicit approval probably on your app
Yeah.
from the customer.
Yeah. Most likely. Yeah.
So we need a bit of guidance ultimately. So if we can give you sort of typical fintech companies, then you can maybe say, okay, guys, you have to put this in the contract, you have to put this in the disclaimer, you have to put this in the contract with the bank.
Yeah, I think it would be very good if we take a working example and we could do a paper based on a working example of a real life fintech that we have and how that they've structured it, and then that can be used to form a set of advice and guidance for new fintechs. That's a really good idea. Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, it's very hard to always just kind of give a yes or no answer, and I know but it is.
I'm pretty sure that in other markets where fintechs have been more advanced, like the UK or Ireland or the Netherlands, they already have something. Maybe you can collect those best practices and bring them here.
Yeah, definitely. And if it is consent-based, it gets a little bit more tricky because if they say no, you have to have a mechanism for definitely not processing that information, and that's where it gets a little bit tricky in practice. And it's not just about contracts; it's about what you actually do on the ground as well. But I definitely think we could do a working example and then get some advice based on that. It's a really good idea.
When it comes to, for example, sharing the data to another third-party companies, I'm sure they sell their data to them, right? Like, do you know what's like? How do companies value their data and sell it to other companies, or?
I don't know how they do that, and I think that probably is a negotiation between the seller and the purchaser.
Part of the revenue generation, probably in a few years.
Yeah, and again, once you have the right permissions, you can sell the data. How much you get for that data, I don't know, and I don't know how to advise you on that other than to talk to a data broker. But the data brokerage business is huge. I mean, Facebook buys data from data brokers to create these very complex views on every single user that they have. So it's a big business, but it's making sure you have the right permissions before you go and do that is very important.
Yeah, but this data, the availability of data also provides new opportunities.
It does, yeah, huge.
So we have a fintech in town who have already 3,000 SMEs, and they do the point-of-sale transactions.
Yeah.
So they have a pretty good view on how good a SME performs.
Yeah.
If that individual SME allows them to give the data to the bank, then the bank suddenly has a tool to give a better credit rating to that SME and maybe give a loan to them.
Yeah.
So there's so many opportunities, and here in this market, probably never in the GC nowhere, people think about this.
Yeah.
So we need to help our fintech community to see how they can protect themselves.
Yes.
Because the number of transactions are
huge.
already huge.
Yeah.
Thousands of transactions per day already.
And it does depend on how the fintech is modeled itself. So, like, are they taking some of the, say, the credit risk or the purchasing risk, and then they're just sending a remittance back to the bank that's, that's a kind of a bundled positive negative, or are they doing individual transactions that are being routed through them back into the bank? And that will all change about in terms of who controls the data ultimately. But if you're dealing with an SME, so if it's a company dealing with a company, data protection rules don't apply.
So one other example. So if I use my Apple Pay,
Yeah.
then they take it from my credit card. So the credit card has my information.
Yeah.
But now suddenly Apple also has my information. Did I ever give consent to that?
I would have to look at the privacy notice. I'd be very surprised if that wasn't part either of the contract or you agreed to that when you signed up to the service. But again, so Apple, who are a hardware and software company, now have all this payment information about people's coffee habits.
Yeah.
It's very interesting about what they can now do and sell that data.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think this idea, data is hugely valuable. I mean, the companies I mentioned at the start only make money from data. I mean, pretty much Google, Facebook, all their revenue comes from processing personal data. It doesn't come from, even though they have hardware arms in Google, but it's tiny compared to what they make from data. And it is about how you make sure you structure yourself correctly, get the right data controller, data processor agreements in place, and then get the right agreements with the end user, and then suddenly this door opens up to be able to utilize this information, not just for your own good, but it also benefits the end user as well. I mean, I think it's to get those consents and how we write our consent requests needs to be done very carefully, because it does benefit me as a user for some analytics that are done on my data, or some opportunities and discounts, et cetera, that I might get from that analysis.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to add on that point that you just made, which is Google makes much of its money off of data, but the other part is advertising.
Yeah.
It's targeted advertising.
But that's
where fintechs can also sort of use the information, right, to drive that targeted advertising at clients.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. And how they've built profiles and been able to say exactly what I like and send me an advertisement, purchasing a product that I might like is very complex. And the algorithms involved are very, very detailed. And they want more information. So where you as a fintech have information, again, that data brokerage market becomes very big as well if you have the right permissions.
It's scary because you can test it. If you say, I would like to go to Cyprus on my next holiday, Cyprus, I'm pretty sure that 10 minutes from now I get an offer for a Cyprus holiday.
But there's a funny thing about that, right? So we're now all in the same room, and our phones are all in proximity to each other.
Yeah.
And we've been that way for about an hour.
Yeah.
So they will know that we've all been in proximity for an hour. They're going to go, well, maybe they're friends. Maybe they work together. Maybe they know, they'll go time of day. They'll go, maybe they work together. So then they'll go, well, maybe they like to go on holidays together, or to the same locations. Maybe they'll talk about holidays together. And then one of us has been to Cyprus in the last 12 months. That's probably why you're going to get the advertisement rather than it listening to your conversation. But you might get weird adverts, and then if you pay attention to other stuff you might get, so you might get shoes or tennis rackets, because we play tennis. And then suddenly you're like, why am I getting this? Well, it's because your phone was next to mine or Tad's. Yeah. Oh, the amount of data, the amount of metadata being collected at any given moment is just incredible.
This is very old, very new to me, but the idea of what is valuable data, your phone knows what time you sleep, your phone knows how many steps you've taken, are you active, are you not, are you sleeping well, are you not, and based on that, something that's very close to you in your pocket has a lot and walks with you.
Yeah.
Knows a lot more about you than maybe a family member.
Yeah.
Or a partner. And that's quite interesting and scary that your phone is walking with you, recording everything.
But then you try and think about how do you anonymize that data? Because we all tend to do the same things at the same time every single day. We go to work roughly at the same time, we come back at the same time, we might go to lunch roughly at the same time. So even if you take out certain individual markers from that data, it wouldn't take you long to figure out which one in a big data set was Daniel Patterson, because this time for lunch he went to KFC. And he's the only one who does that in the group.
Yeah. So our QFC rules that you do are completely aligned with what's happening in the country?
In terms of their guidance, yes, the country's law needed some implementing measures, and the guidance that they've published would be very much in line with what we've done today, or what we're doing today. And we've also looked to our nearest neighbours and to the EU in particular to make sure that what we're doing is aligned internationally for that best practice.
So if probably some of the fintechs would like to move to Saudi,
Yeah.
then we can get sort of guidance from you on what are the rules in Saudi.
We will over time, yes, we will definitely do that. And then for the like you were going to Oman, the same type of thing, yeah, yeah. But also then, if you want to expand into Europe, hopefully what we've built in terms of a model here will mean that any additional, compliance requirements would be very minimal and it'd be very easy for them to meet. So again, opening up a 300 million person market pretty easily.
Any questions from the audience?
Just a comment from Laurie. She's saying good stuff, QFC. Nice presentation, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Laurie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah, well done.
I don't know what happened with my presentation though.
Thank you very much.
It just disappeared.
Oh, why?
When there was supposed to be text.
Oh, okay. So we can put this online, definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Daniel.